My daughter's last words to me were, "Daddy, did you see me wave?" She was still wearing her graduation cap when they brought her to me on the grass. The little blue tassel I had straightened for her that morning was matted to the side of her face. Her name was Penny. She was 10 years old, and she died in my arms while parents around us were still screaming and running and not understanding what had just happened. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL. I have been in situations where everything around me was chaos, and my job was to stay cold and make decisions. I know how to shut the part of myself down that would get me killed. I have done it in places you have never heard of, in the dark, for reasons that would never be made public. None of that prepared me for holding Penny on that field. It was the last Saturday in May. Clearwater Elementary in Denton, Texas. The 5th grade graduation ceremony. The school held it on the football field behind the building every year, folding chairs set up in rows, a little stage with a podium, parents standing 3 deep along the sides because there were never enough seats. Penny had practiced her walk across the stage 4 times the week before. She kept asking me if her dress looked right. It was yellow. She had picked it herself. My wife Donna had driven separately because she was coming from a baby shower for her sister. I was there early, standing along the left side near the fence with my phone out, trying to get a good angle. Penny found me in the crowd before the ceremony started and waved from the 3rd row. That is the wave she asked me about at the end. I saw her wave. I just never got to tell her. The shots came from outside the fence on the east side of the field. 3 shooters, we would learn later, positioned behind the tree line that separated the school property from an empty lot that had been sitting vacant for years. They opened fire during the applause after the principal's welcome speech. The noise masked the first 2 seconds. People thought it was something else. Fireworks, a car backfire, and then a child in the front row fell forward off her chair and everyone understood at once. 11 children were shot. 4 of them died at the scene. Penny and a boy named Freddie. I only know his name because his mother and I sat next to each other in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours, died later that afternoon. 6 total. 6 children in graduation caps. The police response was fast. I will give them that. Denton PD had officers on scene within 4 minutes, but the shooters were already gone. They had come in through the empty lot, fired from cover, and disappeared before anyone had processed what was happening. Professional. That is the word the detective used when he briefed family members 3 days later in a conference room that smelled like burned coffee and industrial cleaner. He said it like it was a compliment. Like he was impressed. I had to put my hand flat on the table to keep myself in the chair. The official position for the first 2 weeks was gang-related, stray violence. Wrong place. The theory was that one of the parents in attendance was a known associate of a local gang, and the shooting was a targeted hit that went sideways. They said these things in press conferences with the careful language of people covering their uncertainty with procedure. I sat in the back of those press conferences and watched and said nothing. I know what a targeted hit looks like. 3 shooters with coordinated positions and a planned exit route is not a hit that goes sideways. That is a hit that goes exactly as intended. Donna wanted me to let the investigators work. She is not a person who gives up easily. She taught 3rd grade for 9 years. She has more patience than anyone I've ever known. But grief had made her very still. She sat in Penny's room a lot. She kept Penny's backpack on the chair by the desk where Penny had left it the last morning. I would stand in the doorway and watch my wife sit there and not know what to say, and then I would go back to the kitchen table where I had my laptop open and my notes spread out, and I would keep working. I was not a detective. I was not a federal agent. I was a carpenter who had been a Navy SEAL, and my daughter was dead, and I was not going to sit still. I started with the empty lot. Public records are available to anyone who wants to spend enough time on the county assessor's website. The lot on the east side of Clearwater Elementary, 4.2 acres, zoned light commercial, had been vacant for 11 years. It had changed hands twice in that time. The most recent owner, as of 14 months before the shooting, was a holding company called Meridian Property Group. The registered agent for Meridian Property Group was a man named Arthur Stokes. Arthur Stokes was the founder and CEO of Stokes Development Partners, one of the larger private real estate development firms in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. His company had completed 9 commercial projects in the last 6 years. He had a profile in the Dallas Business Journal. His daughter had a wedding announcement in the society pages of the same paper. He coached his son's youth soccer team. He had also, according to city council minutes I pulled from the Denton municipal website, submitted a proposal 8 months before the shooting to purchase the adjacent school property for a mixed-use development project. The proposal was denied. A second proposal, submitted 4 months later with a revised plan and an increased offer price, was also denied. The school board's position was that the elementary school was at capacity, the neighborhood was growing, and they were not interested in selling. I read those minutes at 2 in the morning at my kitchen table. I read them 3 times. I want to be very careful here about what I say next, because I had no proof of anything at that point. What I had was a real estate developer who had been turned down twice and owned the land where 3 shooters had positioned themselves to kill children. That is not evidence. I knew that. I had enough experience watching cases fall apart to know that correlation is not the same as a case. But I also knew that I was going to find out the truth, and that I was going to do it quietly, and that I was going to do it right. The first person I found was a man I'll call the middleman, because that is what he was. I am not going to use his real name here, because he eventually cooperated with federal investigators and testified under oath, and the arrangement he made in exchange for that testimony means I will respect the privacy his lawyers negotiated. What I will tell you is how I found him. One of the 3 shooters had been identified by police within the first week. His name was released to the media. He was a 28-year-old with a prior felony conviction for aggravated assault, who had been living in a rooming house in East Denton. He had disappeared after the shooting. I found his last known address, drove past it twice, and then started talking to people in the neighborhood, not as an investigator, just as a man asking questions. A neighbor mentioned a name. That name led me to a bar on the south side of town, where a man who had known the shooter sometimes drank on Friday evenings. I sat at that bar for 3 Friday evenings before I had a conversation worth having. The man I spoke to was careful, the way people are careful when they know something dangerous. He drank slowly. He watched the door, but he had known the shooter since they were teenagers, and there was something in him that was not comfortable with what had happened. Not remorse exactly, more like a man who had a weight on him he had not agreed to carry. I did not push. I asked questions and listened, and let silences sit. I had spent years interrogating people in conditions a lot more hostile than a bar in Denton, Texas. And the most important thing I learned from all of that is that silence pulls harder than pressure. He told me the shooter had been recruited for the job through a man he knew only by a nickname. He told me the payment had been in cash, divided 3 ways, totaling an amount that would later be confirmed in court. He told me the recruiter had made very clear that the job was on a specific date at a specific location, and that maximum disruption was the goal. Those were the words he used. Maximum disruption. I asked him how he knew this. He said he'd been asked first and had said no. I drove home that night and sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. I did not want to bring whatever was on me into the house where Donna was sleeping. Finding the recruiter took another 3 weeks. I will not detail all of it here because some of the methods I used to gather information exist in a gray area that I am not proud of and am not going to document. What I will say is that when you have the skills I have and the motivation I had, obstacles that would stop other people do not stop you the same way. I found who I needed to find. The recruiter was a man in his 40s who had done contract work, legitimate and otherwise, for various parties over the years. He was not stupid. He had insulated himself carefully. But insulation only works until someone gets through the outer layer. And once I was talking to him directly, he understood very quickly that his options were limited. I told him I was not law enforcement. I told him I was the father of one of the children who died. I told him I already knew about Beridian Property Group and Arthur Stokes. He did not confirm anything that night. He asked me to leave. But he called the number. 2 days later, that number connected, through a chain I will not describe, to someone who'd been watching Arthur Stokes for reasons entirely unrelated to what had happened at Clearwater Elementary. A federal investigator who had been building a financial fraud case against Stokes for 18 months and had been looking for a way to add additional charges with enough weight to guarantee prosecution. I want to be clear, I did not hand the recruiter to the FBI. I did not make any deals or arrangements or representations of any kind. What I did was share what I had found with someone I trusted, a former commanding officer who had retired and had contacts in federal law enforcement, and let him make the calls he thought needed to be made. I kept my hands clean because I needed them to be clean. I had a daughter to get justice for, and I was not going to let anything I did become a reason for a case to fall apart. The federal investigation that followed took 4 months. I was not part of it. I was not briefed on it. I found out how it was progressing the same way the public did, through news reports and the occasional call from the Assistant U.S. Attorney's Office asking me to confirm facts about my independent research, which I did, fully and without withholding anything. Arthur Stokes was indicted on 6 counts of murder for hire, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 19 counts of financial fraud that the expanded investigation had uncovered. The murder charges carried the weight that the prosecutors needed. His attorneys were expensive and experienced, and they filed every motion available to them. None of it changed the outcome. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Donna and I sat in the courtroom for most of it. She did not cry much during the proceedings. She had cried until there was nothing left, months before. But she held my hand every day when the jury came in and every day when the jury was excused. The recruiter testified. The middleman testified. Financial records showed 2 wire transfers totaling $120,000 from a Meridian Property Group subsidiary account to a shell company that no longer existed. Phone records placed Stokes in contact with the recruiter on 8 occasions in the 6 weeks before the shooting. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I was standing in the hallway outside the courtroom when the verdict came in. I had stepped out to get water from the fountain at the end of the hall. A court officer came and told me they were reconvening. I walked back in and sat down next to Donna, and she took my hand, and we waited. Guilty on all counts. Stokes received 6 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. His assets were frozen pending civil litigation brought by the families of the victims. Meridian Property Group was dissolved. The 4.2-acre lot that his company had owned behind Clearwater Elementary, the lot where 3 men had stood in the trees and shot children in graduation caps, was seized by the city and transferred to the school district. They built a garden there. The PTA organized it. Each of the 6 children who died has a tree planted in their name. Penny's is a live oak because she had a project about Texas trees in 4th grade and live oaks were her favorite. Donna tends it every Saturday morning. Sometimes I go with her. Sometimes I stand at the fence and watch her and think about the yellow dress and the wave from the 3rd row and the question my daughter asked me as she was leaving. I saw her wave, Penny. I saw her wave, Penny. I saw it. I just needed you to know that. I still think about the moment I found Arthur Stokes' name connected to that lot. It was 2 in the morning and the kitchen was quiet, and I had been staring at county records for 3 hours. Something in me went very still. Not angry, not relieved, just still. The way you get when a thing you suspected turns out to be real, and the weight of it lands all at once. People ask me sometimes how I kept going through those months. How I sat at that table every night after putting in a full day of work, after checking on Donna, after doing all the things a person has to do just to keep a household running when grief is living in it too. I don't have a clean answer. What I know is that quitting never felt like an option. Not because I am some exceptional person. I am not. I made mistakes during the investigation. I followed wrong leads. I wasted 2 weeks on a theory that went nowhere. But I got back to the table every time. That is the only thing that separates the people who find the truth from the people who don't. Not talent, not resources, not connections. Just the decision to keep going when it would be easier to stop. Arthur Stokes was a man with money and lawyers and a reputation he had spent decades building. He believed that insulation was the same as protection. He believed that enough distance between himself and the act meant he would never be held responsible for the act. What he did not account for was that actions have weight that does not disappear just because you structure the paperwork carefully. Every wire transfer existed. Every phone call left a record. Every person he brought into his plan was a person who eventually had to decide whether loyalty to him was worth the rest of their life. It wasn't. It never is. The architecture of the cover-up is only as strong as the people holding it up, and people, under enough pressure, tell the truth. Penny deserved better than what happened to her. That is the simplest thing I know. She was 10 years old, and she had a favorite tree, and she wanted me to see her wave. She was not a consequence of someone else's business strategy. She was a person. All 6 of those children were people with parents who loved them and futures that were taken without their knowledge or consent by a man who looked at a piece of land and decided that it was worth more than they were. I don't want to make what I did sound heroic. I was a father who could not sleep and had a specific set of skills and refused to accept an answer that didn't fit the facts. That is all. But I think there is something in that worth saying plainly. The truth is findable. It requires honesty about what you know and what you don't. It requires the discipline to follow evidence instead of emotion, even when emotion is all you feel. And it requires the willingness to keep sitting down at the table when everything in you wants to walk away and just grieve. Penny's tree is a live oak. It is growing. Every Saturday morning Donna tends it, and sometimes I stand at the fence and watch and think that the most important thing I ever did was not leave that kitchen table.